Hi everyone, welcome back to the Photobook review. We're looking at Justine Kurland's book, Highway Kind, in which she photographed a journey with her and her son Casper across the country in a van. And so this covers really heartwarming and challenging aspects of a mother-son relationship, um, aspects of isolation and community with some of the subjects that she photographs on the road, and then also having to do with issues of contriving a reality to live a romantic or idyllic lifestyle. So yeah, let's get into it. I've been troubleshooting new setups for recording these, which you will not be able to see since they're off camera, but I wanted to thank Alex Soth for his videos on recording book reviews. I certainly don't have his space and all the booms and lighting and accoutrements in the studio, but his recommendation for a very simple book review setup is well received and appreciated. So thank you for that, Alec. All right, so Highway Kind, Justine Kurland, the brass tacks. Justine Kurland is a prolific photographer, very active, gallery representation, shows. This book, which I bought in 2017 at a SPE conference in Philadelphia, thank you, Aperture, is her older of the last few books. Since then, she's released a book called Girl Pictures, which I'll talk about in a little while, and then her newest one, Scum Manifesto. But Highway Kind, published by Aperture, Justine Kurland's photographs, and there also are contributions from a writer that we'll get into as we go through the book. But my takeaways for this book are that it's certainly about a mother and son dynamic. Justine Kurland is on the road over the course of several years with her son Casper in tow. And so she's making pictures as a artist parent with her son, as a mother. So there's a really sentimental in the best of terms element to this story, where she's photographing with her son on the road in transients, watching him grow up. And short stories or pieces of prose are by Lynn Tillman, who from my research is also a faculty member at SVA, where Justine Kurland went to school. I'll share my thoughts on the inclusion of the stories as we flip through this book. But certainly a mother-son dynamic here. This book's also, I would say, a few paradoxes. Isolation and community, contrived experiences that are meant to feel romantic. We'll look at some train hopping, some hoboing, and some people living off the grid, and I'll unpack those in the photographs. But this is also a book on growth. The biggest timeline in this book is watching Casper grow up. I don't know how intentional that was in the sequence of photographs, but I imagine it was, because it's one of the more powerful aspects of this book. Excuse these little post-it notes as we go through the book, but they help keep me on task so my videos aren't too long. The book's laid out image or empty page, and titles. Sometimes titles, well, I'm a art professor, I'm a photo professor, so I work with college students who sometimes are suspicious of titling photographs, or the title just doesn't carry much weight to them. I try to convince them or present a case that a title can do things that your photograph can't. It can be explicit or clear in ways that a photograph is ambiguous or unclear. They can complement. But in Justine Kurland's case, it provides a lot of context. So here we have, this is her son Casper, titled Waiting for Trains While Playing with Trains, 2009. This is the first photograph in the book, and one that I think is very powerful. It speaks to the whole, or one of the major themes of this book, which is the real versus the imagined, or the toy versus the real. So here we have Casper on a foldable table playing with his toy trains in the foreground, and even a little box here to note that. And then this vast expanse in the background, rendered beautiful by Justine Kurland's 4x5 camera and her. Of course, she's using a 4x5 camera for this body of work, but it's just this awe-inspiring background. And we see this snake of trains cutting through the landscape, which will be a frequent theme. She talks about, in an interview with her son Casper on Aperture, she talks about the train being a metaphor for photographs and how they link together. But we have Casper, her son, playing with a toy, and then we have the real train in the background. I think that's powerful. I don't know if metaphor is the right word, but a powerful parallel to photographs, the real versus the imagined or the illusion or the representation of things. But this is a back and forth, the real and the imagined, that continues throughout this book. Justine Kurland has a really interesting biography. She went to the School of Visual Arts for photography, and she actually received, as she says in interviews, a full scholarship from Silas Rhodes. And if you don't know who Silas Rhodes is, he's a co-founder of the School of Visual Arts. She was serving him or waiting on him in a restaurant, and she mentioned that she wanted to go to art school, or that she was in art school. I forget which. It's in the Teeth magazine interview, linked below. And her tuition was taken care of. I think in the interview she says she never saw him again, but she benefited from a scholarship from the co-founder of the school, which is awesome. Everyone's dream. She's one of 3 siblings. She mentions in an interview that she had a divorced mother who was kind of carousing, or maybe it led to some tumult in the family. Here we go, entering into the text of the work. Lynn Willman's text in this book, I think, is interesting on its own. However, as we go through the book, I think it breaks the visual narrative, the photographic narrative made by the sequence. I think it breaks Justine Kurland's narrative. These little short essays, or these short stories in some cases, have their own distinct narrative, and they're kind of self-encapsulated. And they kind of pull me out of the narrative that Justine Kurland is working with. That's just this reviewer's opinion. I encourage you to engage with them as I did. When I looked through this book several times, I read the text in every instance, as you should when you're... This whole photo book is an artist's experience that they want you to share in. And so at least give it that. Give it a good, genuine effort to understand what they're doing, and they might win you over. So this 4x5 camera renders this landscape beautifully. It also opens up opportunities for swing and tilt and shifting perspective, not perspective, but depth of field. When I was reviewing this book the first time, this image looks like a Microsoft screensaver. It's so idyllic and so beautiful. We see this train snaking through this perfectly green prairie, hilly prairie, things in blossom, and then even the cleanliness of the trains. I'm in a part of the country where there is no train that isn't tagged. It almost seemed like the air was sucked out of this picture. It's so beautiful. Dan Reclining, 2011. I think these 2 pictures, there's a visual connection that links the train to Dan on this right side of the page. But this image, I think, hits on a major theme of the book. Again, this the real versus the imagined. This camera made a picture that almost seems perfect enough to be an illustration or a computer generation. I don't so much mean perfect in detail and rendering, but things seem untouched by time. That's how perfect they seem. The trains are new, everything's in bloom, the sky's blue, even the train tracks, that it almost looks like fresh mulch in a yard. This image over here, Dan Reclining, he shows up at least twice in this book. We'll get to him later in the book. This theme shows up in maybe more uncomfortable ways, the real versus the idyllic, or maybe how fantasies lead to unhelpful realities or dangerous realities. Prospecting the South Fork of the Platte River, 2008. So here we see already the cast of characters in the first 14 pages. We see people Justine Kurland's meeting on her way. There are other people on road trips. They are people living in parking lots or camping around, or train hoppers or punks or homeless. And Casper with her every step of the way. This idea also came up in my review of Mike Brody's book, the idea of a Dust Bowl, Great Depression, New Deal idea of hoboing around the country, that you could live free and unattached, not as a consequence of your actions, but because you desired to live so. Not that you burn bridges or that no one would take you in, but that you intentionally led free of responsibility. That leads into one of the themes of fantasy, I think, in this book. Cuervo's Camp Bayside, 2007. Drunk Cowboy. Cuervo, in other interviews, is actually, with Justine Kurland, is actually reviewed or understood to be a drug dealer who goes back and forth. One of the uncomfortable realities, people you meet just in the world in general, or people who maybe by necessity or desire want to live unattached. But Justine Kurland making these photographs, connecting with people, introducing herself, meeting them, gaining trust in order to make photographs of them. So to go on this trip, Justine Kurland has two vans, at least in this book. This is the first van. It's you might recognize Chevy Astro. And this is her and Casper depicted it looks like an RV site. A lot of these would have happened. Her and Casper pulled off to the side of the road. Casper being a little boy, a little kid who needs play and who needs space, and Justine Kurland who's mothering her child. She starts this book around the time I believe her dad is diagnosed with cancer, and the relationship with Casper's father were getting on the rocks or became distant. So I think that's in the Vice interview linked below. She is hitting the road at a time where you probably want to be occupied, your mind, and you want to feel productive. Both the vans are what she says tricked out. There are beds in them, there's curtains to pull, and there are cabinets to store things, and they seem very comfortable. This van, at least, several points in this book, I'm kind of a car guy. This is a pretty neat van, especially because it's an all-wheel drive van. It's pretty rare to find all-wheel drive or four-wheel drive vans. This is Casper's, her son's, favorite image. In the Aperture interview, it's a really fascinating interview in which Justine Kurland and Casper interview each other. It's pretty rare that you would get the chance to read a photographer interviewing and being interviewed by the subject of a book, but maybe even more rare that it's a mother and son that are asking questions of each other. But they're very conversational, and when you read the interview, Casper has a very sophisticated understanding of photographs and articulates them. I think in the time of the interview, he's a teenager. But this is Casper's favorite photographs. He mentions the snow or the whiteness, and then the two train tracks, and then this fog that's over the tree line. Waldo Farm train hoppers, packing goats in marble mountains. I think something that's interesting about the subject matter in this book, or some of the people in this book, it spawns this kind of lifestyle of living free and unattached and following the next adventure. Very romantic lifestyle, a very independent lifestyle, but it necessitates a functioning civil society in order to live kind of in this wanderlust fashion. So when I look at these pictures and think about this book, I kind of see that as a paradox, that you could choose to move in and out of this lifestyle only in a place that had the infrastructure of trains to move you across it, the proliferation of grocery stores and Walmarts and highway systems which you could travel across. There's pictures later in this book in which she receives a shopping list from people she meets, and she's able to buy them groceries. That's an interesting paradox or complication of the work, in that to live this intentionally romantic lifestyle takes some level of contriving or planning, as opposed to forcibly living outdoors, not getting to choose in it, like many people across the world. Here's Casper, Simply Nutritious Morning Blend. What an amazing adventure to go on as a kid, to basically live a children's book. This is, it might look like a plain or simple photograph. This is actually one of my favorite photographs in the book. I think the strongest photograph in the book. If you've ever been by a train that was going by, or ridden one, or you train hop yourself, or you have some connection to the railway, this photograph makes the train so small. The landscape that Justine Kurland photographs puts to scale this man-made iron horse in this vast, beautiful landscape. It's so tiny, it's a blip on the radar, but it's at the same time it's so powerful, and so much of our lives depend on things that come over the railway system. Portrait of hobo and snake. So this is another spot I'm kind of, as a viewer and a reader, I'm lulled into falling into this sequence of photographs and reading into it, and then I come to a text block. And maybe you're not like me, but when I'm confronted with text, I'm compelled to read all of it, or I kind of feel irresponsible, even in exhibitions and shows. But it just takes me out of it. You know, I go from kind of these beautiful photographs that I can look closely at to try to understand, or give myself over to their ambiguity or interpretation, and then there's a text block. This is one of the more famous photographs in this book. A podcast I've mentioned on this channel a few times, Magic Hour Podcast, where I was first introduced to this work. Actually, this was one of the photographs included in the podcast and the interview. It's Casper on the back of the van. And you can see how comfortable they've made it. Curtains and all. So the title for this image, Hobo Reading Utopian Text. So this kind of, there's an interesting dichotomy here. Maybe not dichotomy, but an interesting wrinkle. I'll use that colloquialism. Someone choosing to live this way, kind of free from responsibility or in isolation intentionally, or sleeping or living outside, has intellectual and political convictions or interests, philosophy too. This comes up in the interview with Justine Kurland and Casper, that she explains some of what their literature is about, Marxism or anarchism, these political or theoretical texts, and Casper wants to understand it. But I think this photograph in particularly it introduces the idea of a certain kind of person who's really stimulated by deep thought and isolation, maybe like a new monk, except even more detached from a monastery, but they're seeking to understand intellectual or political philosophies and want to devote themselves to that full time. At the same time, they're not having to shoulder interactions with the world. They have the freedom or the privilege to do as they want. And there are a lot of people that do this within society, of course, but this has an added romance of being on the rails and not knowing what's around the next corner. If you're familiar with Justine Kurland's other books, Girl Pictures specifically, this feels very much like a girl picture. Girl Pictures are a collection of photographs made across, I think, a decade by Justine Kurland, and they were brought together into a book, but they're especially strong group portraits of women that are showing agency or action or activity that's akin to me almost like Greek mythology or Roman myths. They're engaging with the camera. They're in this picture. They're slaughtering a coyote or they're confronting a boy. The photographs feel very kind of powerful and theatrical. So here we have two girls peeling a coyote. The photograph is how to cook a coyote, and this is juxtaposed to a photograph of Casper's torso titled After Weston. And what I love about this image pairing is there are two photographs about flesh. We have kind of like a violent, vulnerable picture, or we have a violent showing of flesh, literally a hair being ripped off a coyote that's about to be cooked. And then we have the very vulnerable and delicate torso of Casper. And it's kind of that vulnerability can go one of either way. It can be sentimental or it can be a bit unnerving. After Weston, if you're new to photography, or Edward Weston is a photographer from the 1930s, but this is a reference, not the first reference to another photographer in Justine Kurland's book. So, Last Days of Napping. What's interesting about this book, the afterword and in the interviews, is it's clear that Casper liked being on the road, but he also had frustrations. He wanted to be around friends. He liked being in school and kind of having a routine. One of the ironies in this book is, I think many people, myself included, look at children and with this kind of where the wild things are mentality of want to be in the dirt all the time. They want to wander. They want to feel unattached or free to act on impulses, or rambunctious kids. In the interview, Casper, at least, it's clear that by the time they're coming in off the road, he wants to be off the road. He wants to be in school. He wants to have friends. That's part of the tension, I think, in this book. In the afterward and in interviews, Justine Kurland shows maybe a frustration that what it's like to be a working artist and a mother at the same time. There's a great anecdote in the Aperture interview where she is making a sandwich while trying to make a photograph, and she mentions how Casper demanding the sandwich, and Justine Kurland kind of jokingly says, "I bet Jeff Wall doesn't have to make peanut butter and jelly sandwiches while he's making pictures too." What's interesting too about this book is Kurland's getting permission for all these portraits of and engaging and building relationships with these people that she's photographing. But I think Casper is the only one compelled. Justine Kurland's his mom, and therefore he's a subject in her photographs. I know I was subject to many forced portraits by my mother, especially on Easter. So this photograph, this is the second appearance of someone we see as Dan, not labeled in this title, but the title of this photograph is After Darius, and we see Dan in the crevice of a tree. Darius Kinsey was basically a logging photographer on the West Coast. Made these really, I'm sure you've seen them in documentaries, PBS documentaries, the expansion of the West or the developing of it. Darius Kinsey made photographs of the logging industry. So the huge mills, huge stacks of lumber, groups of men standing next to a tree they felled, instruments they used. He was also a working commercial studio photographer, but this is maybe the opposite of a Darius Kinsey photograph, because here this tree isn't felled or damaged. Kinsey had this enormously tall tripod that he would use to make these pictures. Cuervo astride Mama Burro, now dead, 2007. So this is a Cuervo writing me a shopping list, and so Cuervo needing to rely on Kurland or necessities of life. And if you've traveled much on the highway, you know you're only a few exits away in most cases of a grocery store or a Walmart where people can get supplies like this. But look at, this photograph almost looks like an Anthropology ad or a Levi's ad. The sparseness and the beauty of the landscape, and then this tent that Cuervo set up and his flannel. It's very odd. Someone living outside could create a scene that would be in an ad campaign, but that's the romance that springs up around issues or lifestyles sometimes. Another good juxtaposition or pairing of photographs, Devil's Gate Carbon Plant. See a train coming out of a coal manufacturing facility, and then we see Casper. It's on a lava bed, but what looks like it's the same color as the coal, so it's this interesting big train, little train, small landscape, big landscape conversation between the two photographs. And really, you have to maybe check out or borrow or buy this book to tell, but I'm just really compelled in Kurland's skill in photographing the landscape. I actually don't think about this book as a landscape book. I think about it as an experiential, diaristic book. But the more that I look at this book, I think it's an amazing collection of landscape photographs. The perspectives she's able to find on sides of hills, the patience she must execute in finding the right view and time of day and alignment of visual elements, and really beautiful. This photograph almost feels like something from Mad Max, like this scorched landscape and a childhood occurring on that landscape. I think Casper and his personality really carry this book along. Not exclusively, of course, but it's maybe that personal element that Kurland brings to the work that keeps you turning pages as you see Casper getting older and older. Something that Kurland mentions in a interview, the Vice interview, she has a personal responsibility to be a moral person. She thinks that she owes that to the world, that it's a personal responsibility to be moral. I think you see that in Kurland's writing about this or interviewing about this book. Is she is wondering if this is the right thing to be doing, to load her son up and drive, I think, more or less aimlessly around the country to make these pictures. She's also shared that she photographs essentially to know herself and to be known. That's in the Creative Independent interview below. But so there are motivations to this body of work. So here we have a couple outside their camper with the generator, spare some gas, a request or a panhandle. There's also this philosophical idea of squatting or a punk lifestyle of there doesn't need to be any more production, that people can even live off the excess. And so that's also a motivation for people who live this lifestyle of there is more than we need, and we need to use all of it, especially the things that are produced. So Kurland photographs around a huge swath of the country. And so here we have clear 8th Ward. Feels like Louisiana or New Orleans maybe. And then the detail in these scenes that she captures, this very well could have been one result of Justine Kurland's trip, is this parking it and then settling down, putting the AC in the window, and this like collective assortment of things. Feels like someone's living room spilled out onto the world. American flag, a mini fridge. I love this image pairing. The table and the hood both present their subject matter. And here we have Casper being presented. Here we have a bird being presented. But I love how they're both coming in from the right to the left angle. And it almost feels like you're being presented something as a viewer. Here we have Casper in jeans, and you can see his toenails are painted, which is kind of feels like delicate and fun. But then you see this like maybe menacing horned figure that I'm assuming he's drawn onto the hood of the Econoline, which is their second van. Ford Econoline. In the Aperture interview, Casper notices that the second half of the book gets a little bit more depressing. You feel like the first part of the book is kind of this idyllic landscape, this idea of the West, and then the second half are the people involved in this journey. And it's not as rosy, it's not as picturesque. Some people look tired, some people look worn out, some situations look tense or vulnerable. But it certainly changes. The first half is out in the world, and the second half is almost coming into town. Also, one of my favorite pictures in the book. It feels like the scene of a movie. We have fireworks or beer cans being smashed, and we have a photographer right here photographing some picture. And then we have these lone figures, this man in a wheelchair and this guy back here, and then this great 1970s automobile. This isolated figures in this massive group. Again, if you live in a major city or you're frequently on the highway, you see ecosystems or unplanned communities that pop up below an underpass to shield people from weather who might be living outside. I love the broken glass on this right image and the missing glass on this left image. I really love this pairing. This book kind of is a great complement to Girl Pictures, in which the female characters and subjects in her book have an agency and a power and an authority. It feels like a complement to this book, in which these men, mechanics moving forward, and her son are photographed to be made maybe vulnerable or delicate, or you see pale spots of their skin, or they're in a prone position, or they're primping or attending to themselves. I love kind of this contrast of gritty, hardworking hands, but then a caretaking of oneself. I always love when watches show up in photographs. This is like akin to a reclined nude that you might see in painting, in early Renaissance painting. As I was saying earlier, or I hinted at, I'm a car guy, so when I see pictures of garages, I'm looking at tires, I'm looking at, a really nice jack, architecture of the building, what's in the garage, what tools are there. But I love this watermelon in the dead center of the photograph. There's just Kurland photographs with such detail that each photograph commands attention. It just pulls you in, the exactitude and the details that are captured in each frame. Her titles often point to details in photographs, and so here we see watermelon still life, and then your eye is directed towards really a comparatively small element in the picture. And then we have the title here for the following image: construction, disputes, training. So it's pointing to the consulting group or the law firm on the highway. But as you're driving along the highway at 60 to 80 miles an hour, it's almost unfathomable to realize how many things you're passing by. Lives that are going on, problems that are being solved, whole towns and cultures and institutions you're going by at breakneck speed. No loitering, pointing to a small detail in the picture. A theme we'll see come up again. Constant framing elements in a picture too. There's 1,001 different ways that Kurland could have made this picture, but look at all these triangles and these layers of triangles, a hint at a figure, and then framing this really beautiful little girl looking at her candy necklace. Feels like a very private photograph. Hydrangea. What's not to love about this image? It feels so, I almost feel like as you go through the book, you feel Casper's patience wearing thin, or maybe not his patience wearing thin, but his awareness increasing that he's being photographed. So again, when I'm looking at a picture like this, I'm looking at what jack stands they're using, what truck are we looking at with what size engine. It's just additional subject to this book that Kurland's photographing. Is almost like a car culture. It's not just highway traveling. It's not just train hopping or living outside. It's also, towards the second half of this book, the tools that get us there, the people that get us there. There's so many mechanics. If you're interested, this is an F-150, I think, from the headlight, and that would be a 5.4 liter, and it's a 4-wheel drive. So the no loitering certainly seems to be, I would say, a metaphor for the book. Kurland is on these journeys. She's on the move. She's moving around. She's not stagnant. And so are many of her subjects. Just this really strong, direct light coming in on these subjects. I love this man's sweater and how his position changes. This photo book serves as a great reminder that things can be so interesting when you stop for a second and you compose them and you photograph them. This like waterfall of tires, and then this really beautiful, elegant way this woman's posed herself, just sitting on the back of her car, looking off screen, the same direction the cameras are looking off screen. So many tires. And these details that mechanics write on signs. Again, all these tires, these notes and these details that you see in the mechanics' garages. As Kurland is photographing Casper and years begin to pass, she starts to have thoughts about, what kind of person he's going to grow up to be, who his friends are going to be, what his relationships are going to be like. Is he going to be married? And what I think about what his future will be like, what he'll look like even. I think that kind of speaks to these deeply human questions we have about life, that we also have children in our family. Even as people might question what life's point is or how they choose to live, like we see in this book, people separating themselves or being independent or wanting to or focus on certain political or philosophical interests they have, or maybe living a life as a political statement. We see these human questions and these elements and these well wishes we have for people. I think this photograph reminds me. It's titled Scratch Off. For the scratcher he's holding, there's their van. As we see Casper grow up, I think Kurland shares that with us, these heartfelt questions she has. The book also has a shift from non-working to working people. And so we have people riding trains, we have people asking for gas, we have people relying on others for groceries, and then we have people working in garages, physical labor, manual labor, the atmospheres that go with them. What's interesting is that the whole book has a very mechanical setting to it. All these subjects, these men are doing things in these photographs. I love the soft light in this, and then the harsh light in that. So photographic. One thing I'm not crazy, though I understand, about the publication of this book is when images go into the gutter of the book, you really just can't. It takes you out of the image. Although I understand the desire to want to have the image be bigger within the confines of the book, but an interesting element is lost in the ditch, which is this man parked. It looks maybe at a payphone or behind a dumpster. That's not just content; it's a visual element. That's like a counterweight to this 7-Eleven employee sweeping. But sometimes it has to be done for the publication. A lot of destruction in the second half of this book as well. We see a lot of wrecked cars, worn, tattered bodies, broken glass. What I love about this image is that it feels opposite. We see kind of a spit bubble, a child blowing a spit bubble, but he seems so much older now compared to the other parts of the book. And we see Casper holding also a baby tooth in this picture. So aspects are signs of growth. This is titled What Casper Might Look Like When He Grows Up. In the Aperture interview, Casper talks about this picture. He talks about how he would not want to look like this man. And Kurland says, of course, I don't want you to look like a junkie, but he is handsome. And she mentions his hair and the shape of his face, and Casper's just not having it. So this image marks the start of an afterword in the book that feels really diaristic. Typically, afterwords in photo books are a little demanding of me, I feel. But as I mentioned, I still feel compelled to read them. If you encounter this book, or you can check it out from a library or borrow or buy it, I encourage you to read the afterword. It brings a lot to the work. It gets very diaristic. Kurland shares some of the emotional aspects of the work and the real life context for how these pictures were made and what this book's about that can't just come across in the pictures. Kurland says that she comes off the road really for Casper's stability, that he's going to be starting school and she can't go about doing this anymore with him. But you see at such a young age, he's with his mom and going around the country, and beautiful wear mark in the van from dirt and all the miles that must have been put. And you just get a feeling that they're not just mother and son, they're friends, they're confidants in this book. Even as Casper, in the afterword, Casper grows older, Kurland mentions, and playing video games and in a separate room, but that he's grown and some of these times have passed. But the afterword's a really good reflection. Kurland also mentions that this book, Highway Kind and Girl Pictures, are sort of nested together, which is a really good word to use in my opinion, because they almost feel complementary but similar enough in their setting and their photographic approach. This feels like the investigation of a growing boy into a young man, and Girl Pictures certainly feel like young women becoming women. So she shares that she ends up selling the van, the tricked out vans that they had. After this book, after Girl Pictures and this book, her latest book, Scum Manifesto, is more explicitly political in its origins. Kurland mentions that she wants to challenge the photographic canon, challenge normative hegemony, and topple the patriarchy. So her latest book, Scum Manifesto, is a very different book than Girl Pictures and Highway Kind. It's more explicitly political and of the moment. She mentions in interviews, if you're not participating in that challenge of the normative hegemony or bringing down the patriarchy, you need to be. This book feels a little bit more reflective and human in a way, and maybe more photographic, as it's not a collage. It's not a book about photo collage like her Scum Manifesto is. I like the inclusion of these snapshots as well towards the end. Here's a really powerful section that I'll read out loud. I often explain to students worried about disappointing their parents that their parents were probably much more worried about letting them down. Whether that's true or not, I realize how worried I am that I will disappoint Casper. The child's unconditional love only lasts for a finite period, after which the macaroni necklace and the drawings covered in wobbly hearts dry up. With puberty only a couple years away, it's easy to imagine Casper's future disdain. But it's this fleeting moment. I'm sure you've heard it from your parents too, or whoever raised you, that I've seen it in my younger family members, that even when you're in the moment of maybe the tenderest or most heartwarming part of a little person's development, even when you're in it, you know that you're kind of watching it go by, and you want to stop. You want to stop it because you want to enjoy it as long as you can, but it's good for them to grow up. And a great kind of more contemporary photograph of Casper. We have him here with a bag of chips and it looks like a BB gun posted up outside the Econoline. Now he sits in the next room like any other boy, lost in a multiplayer first-person shooter game, Skyping with friends in a language composed of computer commands and acronyms. The plots of the dystopian sci-fi novels he reads usually kill off the parents in the first chapter, leaving the children alone to fight tyranny on one side and anarchy on the other. Or else he seals himself behind headphones listening to whispery electronic music, like the soundtrack from Portal 2. In his middle school application essay, Casper wrote, "What is power in this wounded world? I could ask the same of the road." So, Justine Kurland's Highway Kind Photobook. A lot of paradoxes here, a lot of personal experience in this book. Do you draw some of the same conclusions after looking at the book with some of those image pairings with Casper and the coyote? Do you notice that aspect of growth of Casper from a baby to a young man across the sequence of the book? Do you see that intentionality required to live a fantastical or romantic lifestyle free of responsibility? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Also, let me know, for the next book review, I'm torn between Robert Frank's The Americans or Sam Contis' new book, Day Sleeper. So let me know which one you'd be more interested to see next, and we'll put that on the docket. Thanks for watching.